Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. David Chao. I direct the Center for Asian American Christianity. Welcome to another podcast of the Center for Asian American Christianity at Princeton Seminary. Today, it's my delight to introduce our podcast guest, Dr. Justin C. Justin is the Assistant Professor of Religion and Culture of the College of Integrative Studies of the Singapore Management University in Singapore. Welcome, Justin, to the podcast.
Wow, thanks for having me.
So, Justin, it is nighttime. You're 12 hours different, and you
Yeah.
finished cooking dinner, and
Yeah.
you're drinking what you said was your grandpa's favorite tea. What tea is
This
that?
this is kind of apocryphal. I remember my grandpa drinking a very smoky tea in one of these convenience cups, the cups that are like, they brew the tea and then you can take the thing out and then you can put it on the plate that it comes into. So it's a smoky kind of South Chinese tea. Yeah.
Wonderful. So we're gonna have a instead of a coffee house conversation, a tea house conversation over Justin's to be published
Hmm.
important and fantastic book titled Sheets of Scattered Sand, Cantonese Protestants and the Secular Dream of the Pacific Rim. Congratulations, Justin, on the forthcoming publication of your new book.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's exciting. This book was, I think, over a decade in the making, a
Yeah.
radical transformation of your dissertation from the geography department of the University of British Columbia. You and
Yes.
I have some shared experiences with respect to Vancouver as one of the sites of your study. For me, that's where I was a seminary student at Regent College, right on the outskirts of UBC, the
Oh,
University of
I'm very familiar with Regent College. That's where the well was,
Yes.
the coffee shop. That's where $4 soup was. $4 for me. I was not a
On
Regent student.
Tuesday, there's like chapel and
Tuesday
soup day,
soup.
right?
That's right. That's right. I wrote most of the dissertation there, actually.
The well has a very important history at Regent College during the 90s because my friend Peter Lee, who's still in Vancouver, he helped
Hmm.
found the well. And it was part of like a ministry project for vocation work and ministry. And
Yeah.
Brian Williams, who's now in Philadelphia, he was
Yeah.
also managing the coffee shop. Coffee culture was really big in Vancouver in the 90s.
It still is. I gotta say, I remember the well on Dunbar as well. Not just the one on campus, but the well on Dunbar. That's where I got a lot of girl advice from my college counselor. Um, yeah.
I mean, this is off tangent, and this is kind of how Justin and my conversations, how our conversations often go.
Mm.
I think off of Dunbar, I heard that the Vancouver singer, is it Sarah McLachlan?
Oh
Didn't
yeah.
she live in that area?
Did she? I don't know.
I think
That this is
so.
the first I've heard of it, but I wouldn't be surprised because if you told me that Sarah McLachlan was from Kitsilano, I would be, I would be just not surprised.
Exactly. No,
Yeah.
she definitely has the Vancouver vibe and a beautiful voice.
Mm.
Anyways, I am already distracted off topic because you and I have so many shared interests when it comes to Asian Christians in the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah.
Um, your subtitle. So I want the audience to get an initial sense of what your book is about. And I think
Yeah.
your subtitle kind of nails it. And there's three parts to it: Cantonese Protestants, the Secular Dream, and Pacific Rim. So maybe you could just spend a little time on each of these three topics. Maybe you can begin with which Cantonese Protestants are you talking about?
Great. So thanks, David, for having me on the podcast. Um, Let me start with time. I'm a Doctor Who fan, so I think time is a very important factor here. I mean, I'm a Vancouverite. I have to be a Doctor Who fan. So
It was
the
filmed in Vancouver.
and also UBC profs work on this. Like UBC profs have been, directors of episodes of Doctor
Oh,
Who.
that's too cool.
Yeah. So let me start with time. Most of the book is concerned around the time frame 1989 to 2012. 2012 is kind of a hard cutoff for the study because it's a study of how Cantonese Protestants, or people that I call Cantonese Protestants, it's short for Cantonese-speaking Protestant Christians, how they engaged the secular civil societies of what used to be called the Pacific Rim. So prior to 2012, the region that we now refer to as the Trans-Pacific, the area that the Pacific Ocean spans between the Asia Pacific and the Americas, used to be called the Pacific Rim because it looked like kind of a rim, right, like the Ring of Fire. And the idea was that this rim could be integrated, right? So like Asians would move to Americans would sort of take their ideas and bodies and move to Asia, and then this would be sort of one integrated whole, not unlike the movie Pacific Rim, you know, the one
I
where
was
the
going to make the
countries
shout
the
out, but you
water.
beat me to it. This is the one
You
with
can.
Wolverine, right?
This is the one with the Jaegers, the Jaeger pilots.
But it's got that Australian act. What's his name?
Oh, that's true. Yes, it does. It's the one with Wolverine, Hugh
Yeah,
Jackman.
yeah, Hugh Jackman.
That's
That's
right.
it.
That's right. Like it's no joke. I teach that film in my course on the Pacific Rim. I teach that film and Die Hard to open the film, because Die Hard is another one of these films that's about a Japanese corporation in Los Angeles, right? And the fake European terrorists who invade the Nakatomi Corporation are driving a truck called Pacific Courier, right? And so like this idea, this dream, you could say, of the Pacific Rim, what was this idea that Asia and the Americas could be integrated, right? And this idea has been criticized for you know being beholden to American imperialism, being settler colonial. It ignores the Pacific Islands, which are in the Pacific Ocean. And so people don't like this term anymore. And that's kind of how we arrived at this term Trans-Pacific. I'm writing about the time when this stuff was being problematized, but I would say that, especially at UBC where I studied, people took this term seriously as a term that described how capital moved, right? So, how did Asian capital come to the Americas, and how did the Americas sort of control that capital? And so, it was a story about, you know, uh, Asians buying property in like Vancouver and the San Francisco Bay Area, Asians having multiple passports, moving away from Asia because of political instability, right? And this idea that that kind of movement would strengthen Western settler civil societies, right? It would make our kids smarter. It would make us more successful. It was all this stuff about the model minority myth, right? And um, and so that's the Pacific Rim. It's a dream. It's a dream of what Asians and white people can do together, right?
That's really, I mean, what you're saying is so helpful. It's very much part of the Al Quran conversation at UBC in Vancouver. It feeds very well into Canada's national myth about being a multicultural, pluralistic, and diverse society. And both, oh, by the way, the capital flow really helps too.
Right, right. And I have to note for your listeners that this term Pacific Rim does not play well at all with the term Asian American. And this is why the bottom cap of my book is 1989, right? Because the Asian American movement, as we know it, was a movement that happened in the 60s. It was a radical leftist movement that advocated for Asians to be considered part of the third world, even Asian Americans, that they had more in common with the third world than they had with the first world because of orientalizing racism. That shows up in my book too. It's the backstory to some of the things that happen in the book with regards to Cantonese-speaking Protestants, right? And so because there were some Cantonese-speaking Protestants who were involved in the 60s in the development of the Asian American movement and in Chinatown movements in Vancouver, British Columbia. Um, and, and what happened was that there was a new migration wave of mostly Hong Kong migrants, mostly for educational and employment reasons. They came in the 70s and 80s, and they built churches that were very different in flavor from that of you could describe as Asian American historic Asian American churches. Historic Asian American churches were very social justice oriented. They were very much in favor of taking money, say, for the government to work for their communities. The newer migrants felt that that wasn't trusting in God. That wasn't the work of the church. What the church is for is prayer, Bible study, evangelism. So, so new churches came into play in the 80s, at the 70s and the 80s. And by the 90s, what happened uh, was that Cantonese Protestants began to be kind of known as a political force, right? And so what you could say is that they got involved in the secular civil societies of the Pacific Rim. Now, if you think about the way that I've described the Pacific Rim, well, what can Asians and Americans do together? What can, like, this kind of multicultural thing? The word liberal would be very appropriate, right? That, and indeed, the first, because the word liberal suggests that, we can be open-minded to things that we can do publicly together, and we don't really need to care about sort of our private beliefs, things that we do behind closed doors. That's not important. The stuff that's really important is the common good that we can pursue together, right, as a multicultural society. And so, indeed, the first movements of a lot of these Cantonese Protestants into the secular civil society were through liberal center-left leaning parties, until in the late 90s and 2000s, the press began to tell stories about how these communities were turning to the right. And that's really where I enter, right? Like I I'm interested in I first became interested in these sets of stories because of these press stories about our communities turning to the right. I felt that, in a way, our communities had been misrepresented, right? Because here, basically the implication is that if you turn to the right, you're not part of this liberal project anymore, right? And if you're not part of this liberal project anymore, you're not integrating, you're not assimilating, you're not part of our society, right? And I was like, those are my uncles and aunties. And turning to the right, no matter what my political choices are, as a college student, um, exposed to a wide swath of ideas, um, no matter what my political choices are, I wouldn't want my uncles and aunties to be represented this way.
Interesting.
I set out to understand what did it mean for them to involve themselves in the secular societies of the Pacific Rim.
Hmm. And how their Christian faith motivated them to take up certain positions within a society in which they were relatively recent immigrants, although Vancouver is different because it has multiple generations. This is fascinating.
Well, they were
Um,
recent immigrants in the sense that they were economic migrants. So they weren't supposed to be religious, according to the dream of the Pacific Rim. They were supposed to be these people who worked for tech companies and worked for financial institutions. They were supposed to buy property. They were supposed to send their kids to school. Why are they opposing same-sex marriage?
yeah.
Right? Why are they opposing transgender rights? Why are they opposing the marijuana dispensary? Why do they want to buy buildings in um, in industrial areas to become churches? Like, what is this? What is these people's problem? You could say that the press was saying, and I was like, they're my community. Don't touch my people, right? So
So I wanna pick up more of the main claims of the book, but I,
sure,
I also want to spend a little bit of time on your personal background
sure,
that you are so helpfully referring to.
yeah,
These are my aunties, my uncles. I'm
yeah.
reading these newspaper articles about my community, and there's a dissonance in how their narration of your community doesn't jive with your self understanding of your community.
And I'm studying at UBC, not with Cantonese speaking profs and not with Cantonese speaking Protestant cohorts, right? So I'm the strange guy who's into religion. I'm into Asian American studies, right? I'm into migration studies. And the way that I was legible was that I was the Pacific Rim scholar. Right. But as I have been saying, the Pacific Rim is kind of not our dream either. So that felt kind of a misfit for me too. And it wasn't until much later on that I was able to articulate that no, actually, it's because I located myself as part of our communities, and we were trying to understand the Pacific Rim together. And that's really how the book is written.
A quick observation.
Yeah.
It's very clear in these first 15 minutes that your personhood and your self-reflection on your experiences as an Asian in North America who is Christian, studying, intellectually curious. You're a geography person at UBC, and you're sort of trying to make sense of the kinds of stories being told about this community that you identify with. So let's continue this mix of your personal journey with your intellectual journey, and let's frame it as storytelling. So, because you tell a lot of stories in your book is full of ethnographic participant observation, focus groups, interviews. And I think this is one of the things I really love about your book is the methodological intervention you're making within Asian American religious studies and theology is the kind of lived experiences and voices that come through so powerfully to as evidence for the kinds of claims you're making. So continue your journey of discovery. So you've got these frameworks from professors and white media outlets. You've got your own internal experience, at the coffee table, the dinner table with your aunties and uncles and church members, that there's a dissonance here. How do you begin to resolve or arrive at some interpretation?
You do it as a scholar. So I went through all the typical stuff that you have to do. I went through what's called the Institutional Review Board, and they vetted the ethics of the project, and they said that it's fine if people want to go on the record and talk about stuff with their names attached to it, then that's great, right? And so what I did was I said, okay, we're going to have three tiers here. I described this in the book too. We're going to have three tiers here. We're going to interview people who can speak to their experience as some kind of like community leader type within Cantonese Protestantism, because that way you don't get that way you get sort of their view on how Cantonese speaking Protestants have engaged these secular civil societies. Those are the named people in the book. Right? They gave consent for their names to be used in the dissertation, and the book is just really a radical revision of the dissertation. Then there's the focus groups. The focus groups were drawn from churches that I did some participant observation at, and I would ask, okay, so I'm doing this study. Could we have people, come anonymously and sort of speak to some of these things that I've been learning about in my interviews? And why I wanted to do that was because if you only talk to leaders, you're going to have a problem, which is that the people may or may not buy what those leaders are saying, right? And indeed, the argument of the book, when when it all kind of shook down to the bottom, was that Cantonese Protestants described themselves as a sheet of scattered sand, yapun san sa, and how I translate that term, some Cantonese people listening to me might be like, that's a very funny translation. How did you get that? Well, okay. It's because yapun is a container. It's a container. And the idea is that in the container, there are scattered sands. Okay.
Pacific Rim and the different locales of the Cantonese-speaking Protestants.
Right. So they would describe themselves as yapun-san, meaning that they felt that they were really scattered and disunited and fragmented. They couldn't agree on stuff, right? And that's what made they claimed that that's what made their politics ineffective. what I think what I'm saying in the book is, for people who are ineffective, these people were pretty effective, right? For people who were disorganized, they were certainly perceived as organized, right? And so the question became, um, how do you write about a sheet of scattered sand? How I got the term sheet was from that greatest of Cantonese speaking Protestants, a guy named Sun Yat sen. Sun Yat sen lectured in his lectures, The Three Principles of the People. He talked about how the critics of the Chinese nation would say that Chinese people can't be a nation. They are a sheet of scattered sand. And what the term he used was "yapin sansa," "ipian sansa," right? No Cantonese Protestant person, I would wager, would ever use the term "yapin sansa." They would correct me and be like, "No, it's yapun, Justin," right? Like, where are you getting this information from? I'm like, "Oh, it's from the Three Principles of the People." So what I do is I split the difference. I go, "All right, so it's a sheet of scattered sand. I'm just agnostic as to the depth of the sheet." So it's a sheet of scattered sand. What I got from the interviews, what I got from the focus groups, was that people felt like they just wanted to speak for themselves. They didn't want to speak on anyone else's behalf. They wanted to speak for themselves. Right? This was their experience, their individual experience. They didn't want to be tied to someone else. They felt that if you make these kind of weird associations, like, okay, so you're right wing and you're right wing, so these two right wing organizations must be linked, and then you might link these right wing organizations with these organizations in the other city. They felt like that was the misrepresentation, right? So in a way, Yapun Sansa was the best way to describe it, because they wanted to be scattered. They wanted to be known as scattered, right? That felt like the most accurate and fair and, dare I say, loving representation. So the three tiers were the interviews with the people in leadership, and then there was the focus groups with the people in the congregations, and then there was a growing archival thing that I had on a drive, right? Just collecting stuff that people pointed me to, collecting documents ranging from advertisements for events to videos to newspaper clippings to court cases. Yeah.
That is awesome. That's tremendous to give us insight for doctoral students out there, for scholars out there who are interested in research methodologies.
Yeah.
Justin just shared the development of his research methodology. So that's on the how, and you're beginning to synthesize their internal perspective as individuals. How did this begin to overturn or contest the dominant narratives from Canadian media outlets, from the sort of Pacific Rim discourse at UBC? And just to note, you're taking samples from Vancouver, San Francisco, and Hong Kong. These are the three metropolitan areas, and you're looking at sort of the internal voices of Cantonese speaking Protestants and how they push up against these secular discourses. Say more about that pushing up and the kind of re-narration you wanted to imagine.
So, um, okay, so there's a difference between what I wanted and what I found, and I think this is really important, because when you do research, you always go in with what you think you're going to find, and then you end up finding the thing, and you go, "How do I write about this? I didn't expect to learn about this." Okay, so here's the thing I wanted to find. What I wanted to find was that Cantonese-speaking Protestants were understanding the world through an explicitly theological lens, through the language of faith, right? And so, for I suppose any graduate students listening to this podcast, it would be like the methods of someone like Joel Robbins, right? Like using explicitly theological language to understand how people practice their faith, right? Um, and what I suppose you need to know about Cantonese speaking Protestants is that we are um, I would say that we have a lot of scholars of theology and we have a lot of biblical studies scholars. But if you think about our communities, we are primarily communities. Actually, we don't really talk theology that much, right? That's highfalutin stuff. That's stuff that scholars talk about. That's what people with PhDs talk about. Like for normal people, I don't know. I think cantopop karaoke and movies are much more relevant than kind of highfalutin theology kind of talk. Um, and so what happened was that there's the doctoral student in me that wanted to find the explicit theology. Right? There's also the Christian in me that wanted that to be true. And then there's the way that Cantonese Protestants narrated things, which doesn't mean that they narrated things in a completely secular way, doesn't mean they didn't talk about God, doesn't mean that they didn't talk about the Bible. But I think that in the effort to become relevant and legible to the Pacific Rim, they talked about how they needed to get stuff done. They talked about the way they needed to talk to city hall politicians. They talked about the way that they needed to build coalitions to get their politicians elected. It wasn't like some of their positions, say on same-sex marriage or on transgender rights. It wasn't just that they were Christian that they believed this stuff. They would say things like, any Chinese person would probably agree with me. Not to say that that is entirely accurate if you look at, say, Chinese traditions when it comes to sexuality, but certainly they believe that, and that I think it's worth taking that seriously, right? What I found was that maybe the explicit theological language wasn't the way to narrate. Maybe maybe it was taking their word for it, that they were trying to speak to a society that they considered secular, and that they were doing so from within communities that they considered apolitical, and that this was really hard. This was just really hard for them, and that they were trying their best.
So do the Cantonese Protestants, are you attributing to them that the Pacific Rim was their secular dream? So in other words, I really like how you're distinguishing your perspective as a scholar doing the data gathering, analysis, and interpretation. Then there are the words, the speech given to you through these focus groups and interviews. And then there's what you do with it. So now we're at the stage of what you're doing with it, like what you're attributing to them, given your analytical framework. And here's kind of, I'm going to try to piece it together in real time, and then you can tell me how wrong I am. Okay. So it seems like the Cantonese speaking Protestants only have available to them the language of secular society to describe their language, to describe their experience. And so they're going to adopt that language because it's near at hand, right? Their language is just tools to describe their experience. And in lieu of any other language, theological or otherwise, they're going to use the near at hand stuff. So
Yeah.
that's what they're presenting to you. Then you have to figure out, how good is that language for what you see comprehensively, right? So maybe I see you nodding. So maybe you can just riff on that and edit me.
Sure. I mean, I think the term sheet of scattered sand is very relevant here because every person that I talked to felt that they could only speak from their own experience. That experience had to do with what they were trying to do and organize with fellow Cantonese speaking Protestants to engage secular civil society in a way that they felt promoted the common good. If only it weren't so frustrating to organize among, organize their fellow Cantonese Protestants. They felt that they had a vision of civil society to promote, and that vision of civil society tended to be a society that was democratic and rational. In their words, rational. A society that took scientific claims seriously, that didn't undermine their children's mental health, that
Yep.
that basically did things in a reasonable way that didn't shake up the system that much. So as they described this society, what I came to understand was that they felt that their churches shouldn't be part of the action. And so if you ask like a Cantonese Protestant, so how is your church involved? They'd be like, what kind of question is this? My church is not involved. My church is here for prayer and Bible study and evangelism. Um, I am involved because I care as a citizen about my society.
Is
And
is
so,
is that the secularizing move?
so in my dissertation, I claimed that that was the secularizing move. In my book, I'm a little bit more agnostic about it
Interesting.
because I feel like calling that secularizing, I was in my 20s when I wrote my dissertation, and I really needed that to be true. And I think I make the case for it in the dissertation. I think that's why they passed me. But I'm in my 30s now, David. I look at that claim and I go, are you trying to point out to them that there's something that you know something about them that they don't know about themselves? That's again, that's that's what you do in your 20s. When you
Hmm.
grow up, you start to see things from a broader perspective, and you go, I think people are just messy.
Hmm.
I I don't think, and I don't think that it's my place to point out what people don't know about themselves. I think it's much more productive to say to everyone in the study, hey, I think we all see the same thing. And even if I don't see the same thing that you, or even if we don't see it the same way, I think we all see the same thing. I don't think we're crazy. I think we all see that there's a society out there that scares you. And that society is what you're describing as the world outside of your church. Let's call it secular. Some of them did. And then let's look at what's scaring you about the society. Well, the societies that we looked at, Vancouver, San Francisco, and Hong Kong, are all Pacific Rim societies. They have this narrative of progress. They have this narrative of what it means for that society to be hooked into larger global processes that span the Pacific. And that narrative of progress can feel like the ground under you is shifting because maybe you feel like your values, your family values, what are they teaching my kids in school? What are they um what do they think about me as a Christian? Um are they racist against me? Like, is this going to result in me not being able to have my stuff, have my home? Right? These are scary existential questions, and they're not crazy to think this way. Right? That's what I'm saying.
That's really helpful. You mentioned earlier how, given the Cantonese-speaking Protestants and their positions on any number of political or social issues, and I'm just thinking of in the Canadian context, because we both share that in particular. The media would present their pivot from left to right. So they were given any number of moral political stands on issues, especially around the family or maybe education or what have you. They were seen as right. And then your comment earlier was, well, you became a little uncomfortable with that characterization of your aunties and uncles. So
I'm still deeply uncomfortable
so
with it, and
say,
I still talk to reporters, and I tell them that I'm uncomfortable with
So
it.
say more. What do you tell the reporters about your uncomfortableness?
I, I I say this: if they're joining the Conservative Party, it's a political party,
Unpack that. Like, okay,
right?
me, me.
Like I'm saying, if they've joined the Conservative Party, they've joined a Canadian political party. These are not people who are not you're like, the claim is that they're not integrated because they're going to the right, and I'm like, no, they're integrating on the right. You don't like the way that they're integrating. It doesn't mean th're not integrating. Right? Just because you don't like it doesn't mean they're not doing the thing.
You do think that the characterization of their politics as right is an accurate characterization?
I would say that in the Canadian context, there was a lot of talk about the place of the Conservative Party in Cantonese speaking Protestant communities, and that was messy. What I mean by messy is that not everyone joined the Conservative Party. This is a sheet of scattered sand. There were certainly Conservative Party operatives that operated in the community. There were also Liberal Party operatives. There were Liberal Party Cantonese Protestants too, who were very upset at the Conservatives and what they felt was a growing hegemony. There were people in the focus groups who were quite uncomfortable with this, right? Like, sure, maybe we agree with with the with what the Conservative Party at a certain time might stand for in terms of same-sex marriage or taxes or what have you. But to be a party member, that's a bridge too far, right? And so again, it's a sheet of scattered sand. It's not like people. It's not like when we talk about Cantonese speaking Protestants joined the Conservative Party. Yeah, some of them did to varying degrees,
Hmm.
and that's the argument of the book, the varying degrees part. It's a sheet of scattered sand.
Interesting, interesting. Let's maybe step back a little bit and think about your audience, which is scholars, students, but you also said you wanted this book to be more broadly accessible, perhaps even by Cantonese speaking Protestants in the cities and regions that you study. What do you want them to take away from the book?
That's a really good question, because that I feel like that is what changed between the dissertation and the book. If I may, I think actually the dissertation's a lot more theological, in the sense that I think that it makes prescriptive theological claims that the book does not. So I feel like the dissertation was written by a Justin C. who was very influenced by the theological schools that uh, coalesce around what we call radical orthodoxy, around neo Anabaptists, right? And so, like, the major figures here are like Stanley Hauerwas and John Milbank. What they would argue is that, the church, as the body of Christ, is a unit, um, that that constitutes a community that stands counter the secular through its practice of love. And so I think the dissertation was actually a much more preachy document, right? It basically was like, okay, so the takeaway is, if you feel like this is messy, how about love one another?
Hmm.
Okay.
Mhm.
The book, I hope, is a lot less preachy.
Hmm.
And I think maybe the difference is that I've become Eastern Catholic. I don't feel like it's my right to preach at Protestant Christians anymore. Um, I am in the process of becoming Eastern Catholic. I'm all too aware of my own sins. And so, it's one of those, let he who is without sin cast the first stone, right? Um, I feel like the takeaway of the book is that people are messy, but they're not crazy, right? And so when they talk about a secular society feeling scary, but something that they need to engage all the same, when they feel like they need to be legible to that secular society, and when that secular society is transforming in the ways that the Pacific Rim was up till 2012, I feel like it's important to see with those people,
Hmm.
right? What I say about the conversion, my own conversion in from dissertation to book, is that I feel like for the dissertation, I kind of stood above the community and preached at them with theology. And in the book, I'm just one of them. I'm one of the grains of scattered sand on the sheet. And I've written this book to describe what it feels like from this perspective now, looking at the Pacific Rim as just part of this glorious, beautiful mess of Cantonese Protestantism.
There's a shift in your perspective
Yeah.
tied to your own Christian faith
Which
journey.
is weird, right? Because I became Eastern Catholic and felt like I didn't have the right to preach at them, but because of that, that humbled me
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
to the point where I felt like, actually, I'd like to, for the purposes of the book, I'm happy to identify with these people,
Right, right. It's this
even
is
if I
a
don't take up all of their political positions. I'm happy to be like, you know what, uncles and aunties not crazy.
this is about your position with respect to the subject, both intellectually and communally, of your study. It's
Right.
fascinating.
And can I just say that I feel like therefore the book is a better Asian American text,
Hmm.
right? Because Asian American studies is always about our community, right? We're studying our community, or better yet, we're studying the world from the perspective of our community.
Correct.
Right? It's not standing above them to preach at them. It's to say
And
we're in this together.
I want to make explicit how there's at least an intergenerational perspective that is very significant, because you refer to aunties and uncles, which are the prior generation.
Sure.
And there's this, and maybe you don't adopt all of their normative perspectives, but you are still in relationship with them. And part of the concern is, how do I understand this complex, messy, scattered community where the different generations of the same linguistic, cultural, ethnic group are different? Unpack the statement, the aunties and uncles are not crazy. Like, unpack what that means.
Okay, so I think that if we were to listen to how the uncles and aunties are portrayed in, say, the Vancouver Sun or the Globe and Mail or the New York Times, I think that what you get is Cantonese Protestants who are homophobic, transphobic, and joining the right because they've been duped by Conservative Party operatives. That's not flattering. It's not a flattering description at all.
Because they have no
But
agency on that account.
it's a little bit offensive, I would say, right? Because my uncles and aunties are not stupid, right? At the same time, there's democracy movements on in Hong Kong, right? And so one of the ways that the community was described in an article was that uncles and aunties were importing their homeland politics to Canada, as if Hong Kong was a very conservative city. This is the city that gave us Anita Mui and Leslie Jung and Wong Kar Wai. This is a city that undergoes democracy movements, right? If if Cantonese Protestants are importing homeland politics, we're giving you more democracy, right? So so that's why I had the Trans-Pacific dimension in there, because the way that uncles and aunties were described was as if they were from some backward place that nobody knows, and they've arrived here and they've taken their conservative values and they're importing them here. And we don't do that here in Canada. We don't do that here in the US. I was like, no, I may not agree with everything an uncle and auntie says. I may not agree, or I myself have worked through my queer phobia and misogyny and all this stuff through a lot of spiritual direction, confession, and friendship. But me working through it is just me as part of the sheet of scattered sand. What uncles and aunties are trying to describe is how they are trying to make their views heard in the democratic process and at an empirical level, even if their views are not views that you think are good views to hold. Let's have that as a democratic debate. Let's not call them crazy. Let's not shut them down.
So let me summarize, and you tell me if I've got it more or less right.
Hmm.
The political narratives of gatekeepers within Canadian media and national discourse flatten the reasoning and narratives of these aunties and uncles by simply reducing them to the right, as if their intersection with certain uh, stances of the right part of the political right in Canada is simply isomorphic or identical to it. You're saying, hold on, they may intersect, but that intersection includes this whole other thing that none of your reporting actually gets into, which is what motivates them, meaning their Trans-Pacific journey and views. Is
And
that
yeah, and I would say, just on top of that, what could be read as the right or something that's conservative is just peace comes from rationality. And if you think if that's going to be conservative, I suppose Vulcans are conservative then, right? Like if you watch Star Trek, I suppose Mr. Spock is a conservative then, right? Like,
so? It sounds like one of the goals of your book is to tell better stories
yeah,
about our community.
to tell better stories about community and to also locate, like, if the researcher is located within the community, no matter how messy that relationship is. My relationship with Cantonese Protestants is messy. Right? I'm Eastern Catholic. It doesn't get messier than that. Um, I think there's something to be said for love. I
Hmm.
think there's something to be said about the researcher reflecting on their own subjectivity in relation to others, and having having that reflection being not one of hostility or opposition, but an ethic of love, right? And so you could say that part of the conversion of from dissertation to book is that maybe in the dissertation I talked a lot about love. I talked a lot about how we could build better communities that are more harmonious. And in the book, I don't know that I have the right to talk about it. I'm still working at being it.
Yeah, yeah. Did you want to comment about the opening question in the front matter about the auntie asking you, "Do you love the Cantonese Protestant community?" Do you want to
Yeah,
say a little bit more about how that
yeah.
question
I mean,
really?
certainly. I mean, I opened the book with a story. You know, 6 months after the dissertation came out, um, it um, I was interviewed by the South China Morning Post about a Cantonese-speaking Protestant concerned parents um, opposing transgender rights at the local school board, and there was some hubbub about my dissertation. Um, it was that there was some talk in the community that my dissertation had revealed the secrets of the political secrets of Cantonese Protestants. I had been assured during the dissertation process, by the way, that no such thing was going to happen if they were going to go on the record and talk about it. It wasn't revealing their secrets. In fact, one of the campaign managers said, there are no political secrets. You know why? Every campaign is run differently. And if we were going to reuse our strategies from a previous campaign, we're losing that campaign, right? Every campaign is different. There are no political secrets, right? Um, and yet there were people who felt that the dissertation, although very accurate, made it difficult for Cantonese Protestants to participate in civil society. And so they asked me, do I love Chinese Christians? Was this dissertation written out of love? And I said, of course. The dissertation was 600 pages long. The response to all these news stories was that they don't understand us. They don't understand us. I tried 600 pages to understand. I, I hope that's called love, right? And I also said, look, I think anybody who is trying to do politics based on their identity is going to have it hard in politics, right? And so you might think it's hard as a Chinese Christian in politics. A queer person is also going to find it difficult, right? And that was an answer that was very satisfying, right? Because it was basically an answer to say, look, I don't think politics is done based on a the a person or a community's identity anyways. And certainly in the book, I sketch this out even more. I basically say that what Cantonese Protestants had to learn was how to build coalitions with people who weren't Cantonese Protestants. And that journey was a journey into doing politics in a secular civil society on the Pacific Rim. Right. And so, yeah, I, yes, I love Chinese Christians. No, I don't think I made it harder for Chinese Christians to do politics. And the reason I don't think that is because I don't think that politics is based on identity. I think politics is based on coalition building.
It seems like a major part of the book is refining our political description of Cantonese Protestants and how, from the majority Canadian culture perspective, they want to tell a certain story. From your research and field work, you're imagining otherwise. You're telling an alternative account,
Yeah.
um, and expanding, therefore, our political lexicon and our political framework and interpretation and assessment. So that's kind of one thing I'm taking away from your project in this conversation. I want to perhaps conclude on a theological note, because you said the dissertation is more theological, more preachy than the book is, where you are much more circumspect. So that's great. Is it that your book is less theological, or is it that it's theological in a different way?
Yeah, I mean that description was a little bit cheeky, wasn't it? It's the I think the theological project of the book is more disciplined, if you will. I think the theological project of the book is to continue to sketch the genealogy of the secular in a critical theological way. And so this word secular does not denote the absence of religion, does not denote what Charles Taylor calls the subtraction story of, religion has somehow been vacuumed out of modern society. It is to say that there is a genealogy to secularism, and that genealogy is a series of theological moves that has been made. I don't think that it's only radical Orthodox theologians who say this. I think anthropologists like Talal Assad say this. Um, I think philosophers like Charles Taylor say this, right? Now, what I would say then is that I feel like that genealogy is awfully Eurocentric, don't you think? Like if you were reading this in a department of theology, you would say, you know what? Most of those moves were made in the North Atlantic. Charles Taylor says this in a secular age. He says, I admit this is a mostly North Atlantic story in a secular age. What I'm saying is, A, it's not like the Pacific Rim is not a Eurocentric story. The Pacific Rim is a dream that Western settler societies have about Asians,
Which Asians have tended to adopt given the absence of alternative narratives.
which is what the book is about. The Cantonese Protestants want to be legible to people who have this dream, or else they won't get anything done. And when those people, meaning white people, call Cantonese Protestants backward or importing their homeland politics or super conservative or not assimilating, that's really offensive, guys, right? Like, that's what I mean by they're doing their best. In the absence of alternatives, they've taken on this. They live in relation to this narrative, and this
So
narrative stresses them out.
I want to, my next claim here is meant as really high praise, but it sounds like you're doing something very similar to what Saba Mahmood is doing in Politics of Piety, where
Oh
she
my God,
examines
that's
the
that's
mosque move.
very high praise.
Yeah,
I am not worthy.
meaning she's doing an ethnography of the mosque movement in Egypt and then contests Eurocentric liberal ideals of autonomy and kind of individualistic political agency to say, hold on, there's a bunch of religious practical reasoning going on with women who wear the hijab who defy simply your categories of what liberation or freedom look like at an autonomous individual level, which is the liberal paradigm, right? So you're doing something analogous with respect to Cantonese Protestants in the Pacific Rim, which is to say there's a neoliberal political perspective generated out of Anglo-European sort of transatlantic politics, which are not native or natural or fit the subject of Cantonese Protestants, and you're kind of filling out the contestation with your own empirical observations and interpretation.
That's right. That's right. And so, in that sense, I mean, it's what the historian, the late historian of blessed memory, Gary Okihiro, used to say all the time. He used to say, Asians did not go to America, America went to Asia. What I do with that, so what he means by that is that oftentimes when we do Asian American studies, we're looking at how migration happened to North America and how communities were formed without looking at the bigger picture, which is that they came to America because they knew that it was the land of plenty and success. How did that become legible, right? If you're living in Asia, why would you go across the Pacific Ocean to pursue the American dream? This is not natural, right? You don't wake up one day and dream about America unless America is a presence in your life already, right? And so what he would say is Asians did not go to America. America went to Asia and so made those movements legible. What I'm saying is that move, one of the names to call America went to Asia is the Pacific Rim.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. And I think when you're what as you very helpfully say, David, when that's like the hegemonic narrative, then Asians are going to find themselves moving around in that world. Right. Now, what I also said was that this is a world that used to be called the Pacific Rim. So after 2012, things changed a lot, which is why the cutoff date for the book is 2012. I don't talk about the Hong Kong protests. I don't talk about
Hmm.
affirmative action. I don't talk about Peter Liang. Right? I mention all these things in the epilogue, but that's another study. Hopefully, maybe that's my second project.
Right.
Uh,
And that I want to tease into the possible second project or how this book sets up more conversation. So you have a historical endpoint of 2012, and it sounds like there's quite a bit of deconstruction or reframing of dominant or hegemonic narratives.
yeah.
So then, is the mode of analysis and description primarily deconstructive, or are you also because in I'm asking about the reconstruction. Some might say prescription. I want to be careful with that because you're trying to be sensitive about over prescribing. But
I
do
am
you
very
all?
sad. I just feel like I don't have to write. Like maybe this is me in my 30s coming to the realization that being an upstart second generation person in a community is not a way to be. Maybe that was disrespectful in my 20s. Maybe I don't have a place to say things, in that kind of pointed way. I want to respect that.
So I guess the way to put the question then is, in lieu of the framing of Pacific Rim, do you have an
Yeah.
alternative framing that is more productive?
Okay. So I would say this. So I'm not prescribing a new framework. I'm saying let's pay attention to the framework Pacific Rim
Okay.
because that is the sheet on which the scattered sands fall.
Yep. And
Right?
I think that's exactly correct for this stage of the conversation, right? In other words, in order to advance a broader discourse about Asian Christians in the Trans-Pacific, you first have to name where we stand. This
Right.
project is a naming of where we stand given the state of the discourse. And before you can even prescribe a second part of the conversation, you have to first get the naming correct.
Right. Now, what I would also let me say this for your listeners, right? Again, the project ends in 2012. After 2012, I would say nobody uses the term Pacific Rim unless you're Guillermo del Toro, right? Pacific Rim, the movie comes out in 2015. Okay. So so okay, so before 2012, Pacific Rim was a policy term. After 2012, Pacific Rim's kind of a joke term, right? Like whenever I said, "Oh, you mean the movie?" I'm like, "Oh, actually, I do." um, so so what? So in scholarly circles, we don't use the term Pacific Rim anymore. We use the term Transpacific because Transpacific is kind of the negative term. It's the we don't quite know what we're talking about anymore, but we mean that things go across the Pacific, bodies go across the Pacific, ideas go across the Pacific, um, and we're aware that this term has settler colonial baggage with it, but we also want to talk about the agency of Asians, and we want to talk about the agency of Pacific Islanders. We want to talk about everyone's agency. In fact, Trans-Pacific is the crisis term then, right? It's the term that says, that word, that term Pacific Rim that we all used to use, that's kind of offensive now. And what I'm saying is, okay, I get that. I do get that. So what if I limited my study to 2012 when we were on the cusp of that crisis, intellectual crisis in the academy? What if we just use this term to name the social formation in which these people are living? I'm not advocating for the term. I'm
Right.
not saying it's a good term. I'm not saying that we should call the Trans-Pacific Pacific Rim again. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying that this word, this term, Pacific Rim, names the world in which Cantonese Protestants had to operate. After 2012, things are up for grabs again because we don't use the term Pacific Rim anymore, because there's, I don't know, charges of Chinese espionage in Western civil societies. There's the COVID crisis, right? There's the question of where Asian Americans stand in relation to Black Lives Matter. These are all Trans-Pacific questions that come after 2012. I think that's another project.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Maybe we can conclude with just a plug for Sinophone studies, because I
Yeah.
know that you're very active in the Chinese Christianity conversation.
Yeah.
And the term of art now is the Sinophone. So do you want to just explain how your book project then kind of dovetails into this broader conversation of what is Chineseness when it comes to
Yeah.
Chinese Christianity?
Yeah, David. Thanks for that. So, indeed, I am the co-chair until the end of this year of the Chinese Christianity unit in Chinese Christianities unit at the American Academy of Religion. This book is being published in the Liu Institute series on Chinese Christianities at Notre Dame Press, and so this question is very relevant. What I argue in the book, or how I frame the book, is that it's a Sinophone. It's a Sinophone contribution, Trans-Pacific Sinophone contribution to the study of Chinese Christianities. Sinophone studies is a field that, for all intents and purposes, can be traced back to a feminist scholar by the name of Shishume at UCLA. And what Shishume argues is that people who speak any kind of Sinitic language, meaning any language that might be considered Chinese-ish, right? So this is Mandarin, Cantonese, Teochew, Hokkien. Um, Anybody who speaks any of these languages and belongs to a community that speaks one of these languages also has the burden of having to relate to a Chinese nation state, right? Because their loyalties will be claimed by somebody, and that claiming of loyalty is an imperialist problem. Now, why is she saying that? Why is she making that intervention? She's making that intervention in Trans-Pacific studies because one of the crisis points in Trans-Pacific studies is that, say, the people that I'm talking to, and certainly in this conversation, the way that we've been talking is Cantonese Protestants need to fit within white settler societies, right? And so the bad people are always the white supremacists, right? The bad people are always the white settlers. The bad people is American empire, right? that's usually how the Trans-Pacific conversation is framed. And so here are these victims of white supremacy. And again, that makes me just go, victims. We're agents. We're able to act in this world, right? Okay. Sinophone Studies proposes that there can be more than one bad guy in the world.
Yeah. They're bad Asian guys, so to speak.
There can be more than one empire.
Yeah.
And so if you live in a Sinophone community, sure, you have to make yourself legible to Western settler societies, and that is what my book is about. But there's also another added burden, which is that even if you don't want to be claimed by some Chinese nation state, some Chinese nation state might claim you. And suddenly you have to be legible to them too.
This is expanding our attribution of hegemony. In other words, the
Yeah,
hegemony doesn't simply come from the transatlantic, it can come from intra the Trans-Pacific.
yeah, exactly. And so what I'm saying, or what Sinophone Studies is the study of a sheet of scattered sand. Just let people be scattered, right?
Hmm.
Like the because the whole point of being a sheet of scattered sand is to be left alone to live my life in peace. Isn't that every wuxia novel, right? Every wuxia novel, it's the hero wants to be left alone with their family to live in peace, right? They're practicing the martial art as a way of meditation, of beauty, of integration, and then these bad people come. And that's why you have a novel, right? That's Sinophone Studies. Sinophone Studies is basically that at a geopolitical level. We just want to be left alone. The mountain is high, the emperor is far, right? But in a globally connected world, that's kind of not possible. And so communities that speak something that codes as Chinese are going to have a political burden.
Yeah. What I find so refreshing in having this conversation with you, Justin, is you've plumbed these depths. You've spent a lot of intellectual energy to tell the stories of Chinese Christians and Cantonese Protestants with almost like more fidelity, with more depth, kind of a thicker description, to borrow Clifford Geertz. And this is your gift of love and service to your community of Cantonese Protestants. And for that, I really just thank you for the book, because I know it was a real passion project and a labor of love.
Um, my friend Xenia Chan, who's finishing up at Toronto School of Theology, describes it as a love letter to Cantonese Protestants. What? Here's why I say that she said that. When she said that, I was like, "Oh, really? Is that what I was doing?" Because when you write a book, my favorite song while writing the dissertation was Fun's "Some Nights." Because the chorus, or what do I stand for? What do I stand for? Most nights I don't know anymore. Right? Like that. That's that's my experience of writing the dissertation and writing the book. Right? Like, what do I stand for? Most nights I don't know anymore. And so when Xenia comes out and says it's a love letter, Justin, I go, it might be.
Hmm.
I hope it is.
Hmm.
I hope it is read that way.
Hmm.
Right? Um, but that's for the readers to decide.
Yeah. Well, that is a fitting note to conclude our podcast conversation. Justin, thank you so much for taking this time out. I know it's late in Singapore, but I hope that our audience learned some things, not only about the book, which they can explore further as it comes out in November, but also just about you and your research interests. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, David. Thanks for having me on this podcast.